Let's get started then. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today and welcome to this roundtable discussion on what it means to be an early career researcher as a woman of color. Now, we put together this sort of event because it's Women's History Month, but we're also acknowledging that there are no single issue problems. We also think it's really important to look at the lived experiences of people, especially in higher education, which is the field that a lot of us are in, and at the intersection of gender and race. So first of all, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Lina Ashur. I'm a corporate communications and public affairs manager at Sage Publishing. I'm also a writer, community organizer, and postgraduate student, incidentally. So I have, very personal relationship with today's topic. And I'd really like to thank and welcome Sophie and Surur for joining me today. To give you a bit of background, Sophie Chamas is a senior teaching fellow at SOAS. She has a PhD in modern Middle East studies from the University of Oxford, where she was an Ertegun scholar. Grounded in anthropology, her work focuses on the study of social movements, counterculture, political theory, and discourse rooted in, and of course I just closed the document while I was saying that. Here we go. Focused in or related to the Middle East. She's interested in thinking through the life, death, and afterlife of the radical political imaginary in the Middle East and beyond. Sophie's also an essayist and writer of creative nonfiction. Her writing has appeared in Kofla, a journal for body and gender research, The State, Rasif 22, Mashallah News, Jadaliya, and The Towner, amongst other publications. Surur Mohamed is a final year PhD candidate in politics and international studies at the University of Cambridge, where her research considers post-conflict urban reconstruction and conflict-related property disputes in Mogadishu, Somalia. Surur is the recipient of the David and Elaine Potter Cambridge Trust Scholarship, and she's a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada Doctoral Fellow. Her research interests include space and urban post-conflict reconstruction, contested memory and discourses of belonging after war, and the politics of knowledge production in the Horn of Africa. So hello, welcome. Thank you for joining me today. So I think just to get us started, I was wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about how you feel your maybe gender and race have sort of influenced your experiences as early career researchers, just to start off pretty general. Sophie, do you want to get started?
Sure. Thanks, Lina. Thank you for having me today. This is a really important conversation to have, and I'm really honored to have the privilege to speak about my experiences and to get to know Surur as well. So, I mean, it's a complex question because I think it's an everyday thing, right? And it changes. It's different when you're a PhD candidate, which Surur can speak to, and then when you're beginning your career. And in my case, I began my career as a teaching fellow, right? So as somebody on a teaching contract. And so my experience with the academy, I mean, of course, I'm publishing and working on that, but my sort of primary experience within the academy as a professional space has been in the classroom and sort of entangled in those dynamics. But maybe you can start by saying something about being a PhD student. And the first thing that comes to mind, and the first thing that came to mind when you originally invited me to participate in this was when I defended my PhD proposal at Oxford. And so in my case, I work on social movements in Lebanon, middle class social movements made up of, activists with the same kind of, for the most part, same economic educational background as myself. I'm also Lebanese. I grew up in the Middle East. And the one of the examiners on my, who was looking over my proposal asked me if, whether my project was self-indulgent. And this really kind of took me back. It made me think about, those of us who study our own communities. We're interested in producing knowledge for our own context, and then also more broadly, for the global South, if we're working on the global South, the ways in which we sort of have to grapple with or prove that we are far enough removed that we can actually offer anything analytical on the one hand, this idea of who is able to and not able to theorize about the world. And I think often people who are racialized and gendered in particular ways are told that they cannot theorize about the world in ways that white cis straight scholars in the so-called metropole in the North American or European Academy can. And then there is a question of what topics are considered important. And I think that when you come to the Academy to contribute something to your own communities, to grapple with political problems that you are entangled with or socioeconomic problems that affect you, you then have to prove the importance of that to a particular funding body or to a particular academic institution. And I found that quite disturbing. So I guess I felt I moved through the Academy as a politicized subject. I'm not divorced from the issues and the context that I'm invested in. And I feel like that can then serve as a hindrance in terms of developing your career or moving your projects along. So that's the first thing that comes to mind, really, for me.
Thank you so much. And yeah, tricky. I even struggle with it as a student, even of like who is teaching my own background back to me, and it's still deeply uncomfortable. Surya, how about you and your experiences?
So I can really already tell that this is going to be an incredibly cathartic and very helpful conversation. So I just want to start by saying thank you, and especially to that opening kind of framing of this conversation, because I think when I heard about this event and when you first invited me, I also thought about a number of different levels and ways that these kind of conversations intersplice with the experience of being a woman of color in the academy. And I think one of the most important ways is in the kind of disciplining processes and politics that go along with understanding yourself to be an academic and understanding yourself to have something called expertise that you're attempting to create and consolidate from all of these kind of patchwork influences that you had, not just through the specific instance of fieldwork, but as Sophie was wonderfully talking about, from all of these different kinds of inputs and understandings about the space and the context and the texture that you're trying to bring to the academy that is so often trying to strip that out in order to make a clear and concise kind of argument about a space, a site, a kind of politics. And it's almost this process of translation that you're continually having and going through. And that's a particular kind of situatedness that particular kind of academics have to face and pose and think through that others don't. And I think the question of fieldwork is a really interesting one. If you have a thought process around what conversations around preparations for fieldwork look like and what they're geared towards and what their understanding of what the scholar is and what their relationship to the site of interest is, often belies a very specific kind of understanding around what academia is and who is meant to be doing this kind of theorizing work, and what knowledge is and what your access and entrance into it is. And I think that that's a really important access of this process. But I also want to speak a little bit about the embodied question of moving through the academy as a physical space, right? As what it means to actually live and breathe in a university, and what that experience looks like. At least for me personally, I think one of the things that I think about the most is processes of labor and care work that we talked about a little bit interpersonally before this webinar started, but become really evident to me when I'm thinking beyond, for examples, beyond the PhD of what a woman of color in the academy's role is in these spaces. And from my experience in looking at the women of color, but specifically the Black women that make up my institution and how they navigate the institution, it's very obvious to me that they're overburdened with this process and this job of really doing an incredible amount of care work. They're burdened with the work of trying to undo the institution's problems that very much pre-existed their presence in that space. They're also very much burdened with this kind of care expectation that students like myself and undergraduate students will place upon them in order to have at least someone who bears the name of the institution to be able to have to access and listen to them and understand that. And then they also become the visible sites of mobilization and institutional critique, which often enhances the amount or exacerbates their precarity within those institutions, right? And so when I'm thinking about what my academic career looks like post PhD, right? I'm very lucky that I have a postdoc in place, and what even that looks like afterwards. I know that a great portion of my time, effort, and dedication is not just going to be towards publications and research interest and the specific work of teaching and marking and grading and all of those kinds of things that any other person would expect to be a part of their job description. I know that there is this silent job description that I take up willingly, sure, but I also know if I don't do, there probably wouldn't be another person who can take that role, right? And so it becomes really important when we're thinking about the kind of metrics that go towards advancement within the profession, the kind of emotional and physical burden that places on particular kinds of academics, and the understanding of what happens when that work is already done. How does the institution uptake it and pretend and invisibilize the centrality of the individual who created those kind of conversations in the first instance, right? And so when I think about what my relationship is with the academy, it's this kind of ambivalent back and forth, you know, like working within it in certain kinds of ways, working outside it in certain kinds of ways, and trying to carve out a space that makes sense to me and in these kind of spaces of ambivalence. I hope that made sense.
Oh, that made all the sense. We were like nodding our heads consistently throughout. But it was just like this, it goes back to the idea of this sort of the invisible or free labor that a lot of us have to do. And I think part of what possibly complicates it is that there is an expectation when you are starting out a career in academia that there's a lot of things you're going to be doing for free anyway, that this is just how you sort of build it. Do you feel that sometimes gets conflated within it, not understanding that like the sort of amount of time and effort that goes into you know, giving voices to the right people, pointing out discrimination or inequality is not the same as, you know, you doing extra research or extra teaching hours or extra writing so you can advance your academic career. And in fact, you know, one type of work can hold you back while the other one is supposed to progress you, but it's still extra work in both cases. Does it feel like that? Sophie, if you want to get
started. You know, I'll never forget, I was so very lucky to have gotten the opportunity to begin my career under the guidance and mentorship of Dr. Awino Okech, who was, when I started at SOAS, was chair of the Center for Gender Studies, who was and continues to be an incredible colleague to me, but also has become a friend and a mentor. And one of the first things she said to me was, don't think that if you pick up extra labor, or that if you say yes to things that you are not contracted to do, that this is going to set you up for a career, as in, you know, and she's, you know, and she's somebody who's navigating the academy as a Black woman, as a Kenyan woman, and warned me about the labor, the free labor that women of color in the academy are made to do, and the ways in which, you know, we can be convinced that we're doing this for our own careers, right? Which then further invisibilizes the fact that this is a product of a structural racism and of discrimination. And I, you know, when I think about the ways in which Awino guided me and sort of taught me what to look out for and how to say no and to hold my ground, but also how to, you know, further my career in ways, you know, do the things that I need to do for my career, making sure that I don't enable or allow or invite further abuse, right? As in, we should be able to get ahead in our careers without inviting further abuse and helping propel this cycle forward. And so what that experience taught me is the importance of solidarity, the importance of holding each other as women of color within the academy, standing up for each other, giving each other this advice, being there for each other, and, being a kind of collective force, because we can't fight this, this entrenched behavior if we don't work together, if we don't have this kind of a pass it forward approach of, this was my experience, I'm telling you about it, I'm passing it on to you so that you can have the strength to hopefully, not have to go through it, right? And then having that feeling of people holding your back, right? And so I think that building spaces of solidarity, of kinship within the academy, in terms of what happens to us as teachers, but also as researchers, right, is really, really important. And I think, also I share with, Surer, having had the experience of doing my PhD at Oxford, right? And if you are at Oxford or Cambridge as somebody who is racialized in particular ways, it's a particular space, right? And that was also as a student, working on BAME issues, working on LGBTQI plus issues, working on women's issues, building alliances with other folks who are marginalized or minorities within these universities that have a sort of very particular majority, learning the importance of those spaces and of holding one another and of working together. And so there's a collective element to me that I think is really important when thinking about how we fight these kinds of invisibilized, right? And I think the key word that came up when Surer was speaking was this idea of things that are invisible, that don't look like anti-Blackness, that don't look like structural racism, but they are. But they've just been so normalized. The labor that you put on particular people, the demands you make of particular people, the behavior you expect of particular people. What do we consider professional behavior? What do we consider collegial? And who's being asked to behave in ways that other people aren't being asked to behave in, right? All of these things, I think this idea of what is invisible is absolutely crucial to talk about and target.
Amazing, thank you, Sir. How about you?
Yeah, I think I definitely echo the sentiment that those spaces of refuge is what it feels like a lot of times are incredibly powerful and potent spaces. And I think for me, creating them laterally has been the reason that I'm still here. Like, that's really it. Like, honestly, and I think that also brings in another question around expectations around what the space is meant to do for you and how perplexing and odd it can feel when it doesn't feel like it's doing those things. And I think the perfect example of that is the relationship with the PhD cohort, or what that's supposed to look like and mean, right? So often there's this assumption that what the PhD cohort is meant to do is to do this kind of like lateral learning, right? But in my case, because I was one of the only people they were lovely people, but because I was one of the only people who was studying the Global South in that cohort, it felt like I was in a conversation that, like, there was a conversation happening that I wasn't privy to, and I was having a conversation that was in a completely different language, right? And so there is this kind of sense in which the creation of these relationships outside of that helped me to find a sense of an academic home and a group to which I was accountable, right? Who I had to, who would ask me questions about my ethics, ask me questions about my methods that other people wouldn't have access to or understand why they're important, to whom I felt like they understood what the value of my work is, what the risks of my work was, and were able to help me as an individual come to understand myself as part of an academic project, right? Which for some is a lot easier than it is for others, because if you don't have this natural or seemingly essential relationship to any particular discipline or any particular space within the university, you can kind of become unmoored and feel like an atom that's just kind of just winding around by yourself and making no sense. But when you have an anchoring and a group of people who are committed to your academic attainment, but also committed to your welfare as an individual, and whom you can also show that respect and care and solidarity back, it's what makes it possible to get through. And so I think that would be an important aspect of that question for me.
I mean, yeah, we will always come back to this idea of like solidarity as survival. This is not, you know, coming together for fun times really, but it has become essential. The other thing I wanted to talk about, which I'd obviously be interested in as somebody who works for like a social science publisher, predominantly social science publisher, and we've started to touch upon this a little bit, where it's like the institutional problems and then the departmental problems. And I've studied across like a variety of social sciences, but I mean, there are problems in common, but then there are specific issues that come up in each field. And you were talking about field work and studying the global south. And I know it doesn't translate in every discipline the same way. So for example, I found, you know, gender studies to be a slightly more welcoming space and being able to bring in a variety of aspects, but in studying politics, less so. Struggled quite a bit with anthropology and its like history of how we study certain peoples. What have your experiences within your particular fields have been? Sophie?
Yeah, I mean, I move across a lot of different fields. So I have a degree in Middle East studies, but I'm an anthropologist, and some people might not recognize me as an anthropologist because I haven't been trained within, I don't have a degree in anthropology, but I worked under an anthropologist, and I'm confident in my rootedness in the discipline. So I do consider myself interdisciplinary, but there's always been something about anthropology that has just really appealed to me. And I try to bring things from gender studies, from queer theory, from Middle East studies to bear on anthropology. I think the problem with the academy is gatekeeping. And I think when we start to follow the sort of genealogy of particular canons, ideas, ways of doing things, we also start to have a conversation about not just gender and race, but also geography, right? About knowledges from the global south versus knowledges from the global north, which universities, which forms of knowledge are taken seriously as welcome within an academic journal, for example. I often find, I saw somebody tweet something recently. I think it was, I can't remember who, so I don't want to misattribute it, but I saw it on Twitter about, sometimes I feel like when people read or they review work, they read it based on what they do, what they're interested in, what they want to see published because it's going to contribute to the legitimacy of their own work. I think people don't read generously enough. What is this person, this anonymous person who's written this article? What is it they're trying to do? What is it they're interested in? What is it they're trying to speak to? And when we ask those questions, we make room for thinking differently about what methodologies are relevant and important, what texts are important to cite. I think that often reviewers, publishers, editors do not decenter themselves. And I think the question, this is where the idea of anonymity in these processes becomes problematic for me. Because if you do not know that you are reviewing a junior scholar, I think these things are important. I think that junior scholars should be read generously, especially if they're also balancing 7 part-time teaching jobs, right? Because at the end of the day, I mean, there's almost kind of this faux ignorance, I feel like, in academia, like we don't see how it's actually functioning. To get a permanent job, you must be publishing. If you are teaching, an early career teacher, you do not have time to publish. Who gets postdocs, who gets funding, all of these things, right? So if we are forced to rush into publications, into publishing, one would hope that you would be received with some kind of generosity while you try to work through your ideas with very little time, right? So there's a structural problem in academia that I think has gone completely unaddressed. And I think people mention it, but then it's almost like there's nothing that can be done. And so I think Yeah, I think so. I'm trying to say two things. I think that there's a practice of reading other people's work that is very sort of ungenerous and unattentive to positionality, political projects, etc. And I think the issue of anonymity becomes a way to prevent that kind of generosity sometimes rather than enable it. I think often reviewers are protected by their own anonymity, which is why you end up with this sort of cruelty. Often I find the process of peer review, I mean, it can sometimes be amazing, but sometimes it's unnecessarily cruel, I think.
Yeah. I mean, you end up in a situation where people use anonymity as a sort of like measure of fairness, and you're flattening out differences. But then how does that work when the playing field is already uneven and it's unequal? Then who is it really benefiting at the end of the day? So how about you and your experiences with your disciplines?
I have a similar kind of undisciplined relationship to my discipline that Dr. Sophie was speaking about. I have politics training all the way through, so all like the whole time. But I've become a little bit disenchanted with particular kinds of ways of thinking or theorizing about specifically Somali politics in this space. And so it became like kind of an interesting kind of search. How do people think about things that I'm interested in? And what would be an inverted kind of way of looking into the question that I was interested in? Like, what are the different kind of ways of thinking about that? And in a way, I have a relationship with political geography that I think is far less confident than the relationship that that Sophie has with anthropology, but it's similar in that I think there are important kind of underlying ideas or questions or even ethoses to asking particular kinds of questions, which I think my work could benefit from. So it ends up being a kind of interesting kind of space of like justification, right, and proof, and that was a really important kind of thing that I took from Sophie's first argument, which is around this question of proving yourself and demonstrating the validity and the disciplinarity of what it is that you're trying to do. And so I'm still navigating that. It's still an open question for how that's all going to shake out. But I think one thing that I will say, and I won't say area studies in generally, but I will say African studies in particular, has a really serious gatekeeping issue. A really, really serious gatekeeping issue in which questions about, there's a very specific relationship between how data is collected and how theory is produced, right? And where those things happen and how those things happen and who can be considered an expert. And so when I make a critique around the questioning of my expertise with the language ability that I have, with the credential background that I have, if this is the experience that I'm having, you can imagine what it means like when you extrapolate from outside of these kind of very specific elite institutions, right? And this is something that has been an open question recently, and has been something that's been a matter of debate, like how do we start to think about African studies in a different kind of way, and how to integrate different kinds of voices. But this is a very serious issue that lies at the heart of what is considered to be canon, how questions are approached within the space, how knowledge is defined, and how that's reproduced, how particular kind of country specific or region specific expertise or experts are understood to be the entry point or the entryway into knowledge about the space. And I think one way that I could speak about this is through the experience of Somali political theory, in which, or theorizing about Somalia, I wouldn't give it the first term, theorizing about Somalia, which often as an entry point through expertise lends or needs to move through the work of someone called I.M. Lewis, who I don't have a huge critique of, but was very embedded in colonial administration during this time, created this kind of segmentary clan structure for his understanding of Somali political order, and basically did his research in a very specific location within the Somali territories and extrapolated that out to Somali understandings of self across the Somali territories, right? And you can still, to this day, even though it was published like early, and even though he was pretty prolific, but to this day, there's still a kind of uncritical reproduction of that kind of essentialist understanding of African tribalism that textures how people enter understandings about Somali studies. And so then there's the relationship between knowledge production and in academia and knowledge production in the IGO NGO world, which is just a whole different conversation. But like, and how academia then becomes a securitized space of knowledge production. Like, I have a lot of problems, but but you see how these questions are kind of overlapping on top of one another, and the question of how expertise moves, how knowledge is funded, where the starting point of the definition of the question begins. All of these things come to bear on whose voices get described and whose voices get left out.
Thank you so much for that, because what you've done is just basically like opened it up completely, in the sense that when people are thinking of the experience of somebody who is like gendered and racialized within the academy, I think the first thing they go to is like, you know, having a racist administrator or a racist director. And that is just like somebody holding you back quite directly to your face. But then, you know, you also have to consider the canon of your own discipline, the politics of knowledge production, where you are able to output, the process of publishing, and all of this factors into it in a way that makes it impossible to cover everything within this hour, but is a good introduction for anyone who's not familiar with this experience. But, you know, in a sort of in the spirit of like utopian imaginings of like, you know, better futures, if I gave you all the power you need to fundamentally change something within the sort of process that you've been through, what would you immediately want to address that you feel would make a material change in the lived experiences of women of color in academia? Surya, do you want to get started?
If I had a magic wand, I don't know. I think so. There's a lot of layered kind of relationships that come from ameliorating this, right? And so you made a really excellent point around the racist administrators, and they exist, right? And that's a very important kind of lived reality that we have to have here. And I'm sure everybody has these experiences of being yelled at, disrespected, prevented from doing particular kinds of important things, and all of those kinds of ways that this adds up, right? But I think when we think about, like, I think funding would be a really important kind of way that I would start with intervention, right? So if we think about the question of doctoral students themselves, in the institution of which I'm a part, it's far more likely to see Black international students like myself, specifically mostly Black Africans with a particular kind of class and linguistic privilege who can operate within that space, more so than it is to see Black British students who are actually from the UK operating within the context of a space like Cambridge, right? And that brings in a really important question around how is funding allocated, who is able to access particular kinds of spaces, and what kind of research is understood and deemed to be important. Moving along, I think there's also wider questions around, like, funding would make it possible for us to have to be able to create centers of knowledge and learning that are located and accountable outside of these spaces, so that we don't constantly have to beg from the margins in to demonstrate the value and the validity of the kinds of projects that we're hoping to undertake, right? I think if we didn't have to do all of this proving work, we'd be able to do so much more interesting thought work, right? And we'd be think about how much more we'd be able to do if we weren't constantly under this pressure to demonstrate the validity, the importance, the uniqueness, the distinctiveness, the expansiveness of different ways of thinking about the world. I would spend a lot more time actually thinking about the context that I'm interested in, right? And maybe we could start entirely new debates, entirely new conversations that are maybe not recognizable, maybe not legible to the ways that the discipline is contemporarily organized, but could actually be an entry point for opening up new kinds of voices in this space, right? And so, yeah, other than like, you know, storing the academy and stuff, like that's a different question. But like, you know, like giving you a magic wand, I would say I would go for the funding.
I mean, yeah, put your money where your mouth is every time. Fair enough. Sophie, how about your own sort of like magic wand recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree about the question of funding. And that makes me also think about, something that frustrates me as somebody who, is from the global South, and that's where I spend my whole life in the Middle East. So I didn't grow up in the West. And I think but I grew up as a very privileged subject in the Middle East. So I always went to American schools, American universities, and then I went and did my MA in NYU. And so and then I did my PhD in Oxford, right? So there's something about this idea that, like, at least in the Middle East, if you have the financial capacity, you will be educated in English or in French, usually, right? As in, even in the global South, education that is linked to or certified by the global North is the only legitimate kind of education. And the fact that when we have conversations in the West about decolonizing, I find that often, at least in the spaces I've been in, the conversation doesn't get past that. It's about decolonizing the academy in the global North, but it's never about, yeah, but there are universities and there are educational spaces that are outside of English or outside of French or outside of accreditation by the US or the UK or whatever. And what about those spaces that are also producing theory and producing knowledge about the world, but not taking them seriously has been normalized within the academy? And the question of funding, of how money flows, and public spending, government spending, all of these things are linked to that, right? So that, that, and I think that there are things and there are attempts and sort of tangible projects within the global North or between the global North and the global South to try to address this, right? So to try to build, transnational centers or find ways where, you have South-North collaborations that actually center the South. I've heard people talk about this and think about these types of ideas. And so I think, it's not an impossible project. I think the other thing, and this might not sound super clear because I think it's hard to articulate, if I had a magic wand that could just make visible the entire map of sort of things that are feeding into the marginalization of particular subjects within the academy, that just makes the invisible visible and makes the unclear or the obscure clear, that would be something that, doing away with, there's certain terminologies I think that people have started to use that do more harm than good because they obscure, right? Unconscious bias, microaggressions. Who decides what is micro? And microaggressions build and build and build and build. And so I think what a lot of people experience is a sort of constant routine gaslighting, right? Where you are being told in sort of subtle ways, sometimes direct ways, that no, this isn't about race, or this isn't about gender, this isn't about sexuality, this isn't about these things, right? When in fact it is. And so I think sometimes people have to wait for opportunities, like the opportunities to put anti-Blackness on the table, to put queer phobia on the table. What if we didn't always have to wait for that opportunity? What if we were to just sort of come out collectively and say, enough is enough, as people who navigate, and the academy a certain way. And this is also, I think, about allyship and solidarity between people of color in the academy. But I think there's so much that makes things difficult to articulate and difficult to see, that if I had a magic wand that just made it all visible, especially I think if we're talking about the context of the UK, anti-Blackness within higher education, and I say anti-Blackness, not structural racism. So there is a problem of racism. There is a problem of racism that targets people of color more generally, but the ways in which Black people and Black women in the academy are treated in the United Kingdom is not the same. I say this is somebody who's Arab. Okay, so I do not navigate, I navigate the academy differently, right? And I think that part of being an ally or being in solidarity is for me to say it's actually not the same experience for me. And when you look at my institution, SOAS, the number of Black academics that are employed by the university, I mean, it's you know, it's completely unacceptable, right? So I think also there's work to be done to sort of call things what they are, right? And not collapse, in this case, anti-Blackness into the sort of wider category of racism, which is not to dismiss racism against Arabs, South Asians, Muslims, et cetera, within the academy, but to say that there's a distinct problem here that we also have to name as part of, you know, our sort of act of trying to dismantle structural racism as people of color more broadly within the academy, I think.
I mean, that's such an excellent point, and it's a conversation that comes up quite frequently where it's just like, you know, creating solidarity rather than sameness, understanding that we all have problems as a result of this bigger issues, but they don't manifest in the same way. And being able to understand how, you know, racism against like non-Black people of color versus Black people is symptomatic of the system itself, and understanding that will actually help us combat it better, because you get a clearer idea of where this is coming from. But I think a lot of people get lost in that of like, you know, the shallow representation and the identity politics versus, well, it's not about just my individual experiences. There is something, a systematic inequality of power that is constantly being used and abused, and really interrogating that. And what you're talking about, the gaslighting or the invisibleness, is like brings me back to the idea of solidarity of like, oh no, I'm not just losing my mind thinking this. No, it's like, okay, yeah, you see this too, okay, and then using that as an opportunity to actually speak up, because nobody's ever gonna come to you and be like, oh, how have we been making your life hard? Please, I will try and like, so starting these conversations is great. That being said, I personally feel as well that the academy has a problem with opacity of like, you know, entrance into a PhD program or getting a postdoc, or how to navigate this whole system. There's tons of websites on the internet, and you could read for hours and still coming out saying, I have no clue. I don't know how to apply. Where do I get funding? Whether I'm even eligible to apply or to get funding. And I'm very much like of the politics of sort of like, well, let's help each other out. And not just like, what advice would you give your younger self, but like other people that might start, like starting out this journey and need some help or advice that isn't easily available. Sarah, do you have any advice?
Well, I think the first thing that I would say is the people that you are told are going to be the people who, like, I guess the thing that I would say is find your people. I think that's the main thing. You're going to need them and they need you too. It is critical that you find your people. You will probably, or maybe not, likely not find them in the context that are pre-organized for you, right? So it won't be in spaces like different kinds of cohorts or like accommodation or all of that kind of stuff, but they're out there and they need you and you need them. And it's really important because it gives you an opportunity to be in community with people. It gives you an opportunity to share experiences. It gives you an opportunity for people to stick up for you and take care of you. It gives you an opportunity to do the same for them. And you get to do this kind of exchange that's really important and powerful and potent. So that way you don't feel like you have to navigate this question on your own. And I think the only reason I think that I can imagine or know what comes next is because I have people who've gone through these processes, and there's this like piece of, oh, apply like this, don't apply like that. Make sure you have this piece. When I got my feedback back, this is what they said was wrong. Here, let me sit down. Let me take a look. Oh, I don't think that's what you need to be saying here. I think remember that conversation when you were saying that, that's the main thing of this piece, right? And that kind of generosity of spirit and community with one another is not just helpful for information's sake, it's also helpful for you to remember and understand why it is that you want to do the thing that you do, right? It's never when I'm sitting after reading a million articles or things that I know what my passion is or what I care about. It's when I'm having a conversation with someone and we're engaged in this project together, right? And we're ignited in the interest in this conversation and we care about it. We can define why we care in those kinds of conversations. So like, find your people. They're going to be really important. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Like that is the main thing. I used to have this weird thing about feeling like shameful for already not knowing the answer. But if you don't know where the microwave is, not you just looking in different rooms is not going to help you, right? You need to have the capacity to be able to ask questions. And even if the responses aren't what you expect or what you would hope, or given with the kindness and gentleness that you might have hoped, that's okay. Like, you know what I mean? The whole thing is a maze. It's very opaque. You're not going to know what things mean. There's a lot of subtlety and a lot of sleight of hand and a lot of implied knowledge that comes with this territory. And so asking plainly to people you know and trust is going to be a really important part of your journey. I think those are the two main things that I would say.
I think that's absolutely great. And a part of it is, I think as well, overcoming that implied sense of competitiveness, especially when you get to a certain like level in the academy and with certain kinds of universities, there's just the assumption that like everybody's out for themselves. And I was really pleasantly surprised when I started reaching out to people. It's like, listen, I'm thinking of doing this. And then just like the outpour of like, no, we get it. It's really hard here. And also understanding that like when things are written in a very complicated language, or you think that it's really competitive and everybody's out for themselves, I think that's also like a function of the system and is kind of done by design, because that will also automatically benefit certain groups of people who already know the language, who already have access to the institutions, and sort of like politicizing it in that way, as opposed to taking it as a personal point of shame of like, oh, why don't I know? Oh, that means I don't belong here if I don't already know how to do this. So it does require a lot of like mental hurdles, but yeah, great advice. Don't be afraid to ask questions and find your people. Sophie, do you have your own advice?
I think that it's exactly that. It's exactly find your own people. And it's this alternative mode of networking, right? Where it's like, I think we think of networking like, well, if I don't have access to like these networks of power and corridors of power, I'm never going to make it. But there are people that are not sort of positioned as gatekeepers, for example, and are actually invested in the academy changing, and people coming in who are like them or who reflect their own experiences and their own interests, right? So I think that, reach out to people whose profiles you've read, who you've heard about. Maybe you met somebody that studied with this person, took a class with them, that met them as part of a PhD cohort, that knows what kind of person they are, right? And I think, that building these alternative sort of academic kin networks where we help and support each other. I recently I was a couple months ago when I was applying for jobs, and I sent a cover letter to a friend, and he gave me the most valuable advice. I mean, it was essentially kind of, no, this is the wrong kind of cover letter. But he said to me, we're just not trained to do this. That's why we have to help each other. And so he was helping me as somebody that has a permanent job, and gave me the kind of advice where I finally understood, oh, this is the genre of the cover letter. And I remain super grateful to him for doing that. He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to sit and go through it. He gets nothing out of it, right? And I think it's this, when that generosity comes from, it's unacceptable that we're not told how to do it, that only people who have access to particular resources know, and helping each other in that way. And I think there are also things that we need to say to each other again and again. We need to talk about, and I think it's important, I say this to students in general as well, a lot of this is luck. A lot of this is right place at the right time. A lot of this is how your project impacts somebody else. how it impacts their own work, right? And I think that disentangling academic success from self-worth, from intelligence, from from your voice, the importance of your voice, we need to be doing that work with each other, sort of constantly saying, no, like it's not, if the article is rejected, if you didn't get the postdoc, if you didn't get the job, it's not because you are not good enough. And I really don't think we say that to each other enough, where we expose the kind of true Hollywood story of academia, what is actually happening, what actually happens on interview panels, what, and it's not necessarily something sinister. It's often just, people want somebody working on X, people want someone doing that. I got a job rejection recently from a university that I had a friend, I have a friend working at, and she generously called me and just walked me through the process, so that I left the conversation feeling, oh, it's not about me at all, really. And you just move on. We need to do these things for each other, I think.
Because yeah, you're right. It does get to your self-worth, and then, that gets into like mental health issues, and it's just like the rates of like mental health problems for like PhD students in the UK is abysmal, which is then massively compounded by your gendered and racialized experience. So providing support, I think, on that front, like very holistic support. So make it financial, make it institutional, make it community-based and around mental health and everything else, I think is really, really vital. I'm just gonna have a quick look at the Q&A, and Rachel, colleague at Sage, and of course, as an academic publisher, we'd be very interested to know what other recommendations you would have to sort of like facilitate the system, because publishing is, or getting published is such a vital piece of being an early career researcher. So we'd love to hear your thoughts of like what obstacles can be removed to improve this. Soraya, do you have any ideas?
So I'm still very early in my journey. So I'm not 100% certain how I can be of service. It's a difficult question for me, because I had a very difficult experience with not just critical, but I would say an abusive kind of review that I experienced, unfortunately. And so it becomes a question of like, how do you disentangle that specific experience from your understanding of what's possible, right? So this question of anonymity and what's possible behind those kind of things is a very serious question that I think about a lot, right? So in this context, I think there's a question around what the sausage looks like and what goes into it. And there's not a lot of clarity around how or what an output comes to be. And so something that was really interesting that kind of started recently, conversations that started in our department because of a good friend of mine, a very quick thinking PhD who was like interested in taking his PhD role seriously, is that he started like putting on these conversations with academics in the department, where the job was not to talk about necessarily their research, but more so their academic journeys. Like, how do you decide how do you decide to switch a topic, right? Like, how do you decide that you're done with one idea, and how do you start reading a whole new topic, and what does that look like? And how do you make those kind of decisions? How do you know when a project is finished? How do you know when your process of kind of thinking through this article has come to a point where you feel like it's publishable? Do you ask for feedback before you send it out? Do you ask for it during the process? What are the conventions and the thought processes behind that, right? And I think so often when we have a conversation around publication advice, it's circulated around the question of just make sure you don't send the same piece to two journals at the same time. And that's kind of where we stop the conversation, as opposed to the kind of experiential and yes, messy process of thinking through when your work is done, right? Because you've probably thought about this for years, you've been dealing with this for years, maybe you've presented it a couple times, but then you're being asked to create an output of like somewhere between 8,000 to 10,000 words, or that summarizes all of, or engages all of these really important and complex questions. So I think like having the space to be able to engage those kinds of conversations has been really eye-opening, because then you get to hear about all of the ways that the whole process, the fieldwork process, the write-up process, the publication process is messy. So when I encounter mess, I don't get confused, right? I don't think that speaks negatively upon me, right? I think, oh, this is kind of like that one time that. This reminds me of that one time that. And I have an understanding of like how this perfectly encased sausage is actually very messy. And so that I think being able to share those kind of experiences and hear those kind of experiences has been really illuminating for me, and puts that kind of identity piece to rest.
That's great. Thank you so much. Sophie, how do we make publishing a better process?
So first, I just want to say I absolutely love that metaphor of the sausage, because it's also how I, when I was starting out, or even when I was just doing my master's, like you read a journal article and you're like, wow. And then there's all this stuff, that happens before. And so sometimes if you're just looking at the final product and thinking, how do I do that? It can be completely debilitating. But I think, beyond just rethinking blind peer review, I think the editors of journals have a more active role to play. I often feel like there's there's two things. I often feel like once an article has been sent out for review, there tends to be an almost passivity on the part of the editor, like, well, the review has come in and here it is. I think that editors often they've read the article before they've sent it. It's not always the case. It is the case for more and more journals now, right? Or else you wouldn't have desk rejections, for example. If you've read the article and you saw merit in it, and a review comes in, and you know who the author is, right? Like there are all these, the editors have your bio, they have your name. They need to play more of a role, especially if they're dealing with young academics of color, right? Like you have a role to play in protecting this person from a potentially abusive or unnecessarily cruel review, right? Also, reviews are subjective. I mean, sometimes you get a review and you're like, what do I do? These two completely incompatible. And an editor is like, best of luck. And then you're like, yeah, but I mean, what if they're conflicting? And for example, one makes total sense to me and the other is actually asking questions that are from another discipline, from another, academia is subjective. We all have different ideas about how these things are going to work. I think editors have a more active role to play in that, especially when they're dealing with people that are just starting out, where it's your second or your third or your first journal article. And then I have something very concrete about desk rejections. And this has to do with people who do area studies at the intersection of disciplines. You see this a lot in gender studies and in sexuality studies. A piece arrives at the desk of an editor and it says, draws on research from Egypt, for example, desk reject, this is more suitable for a Middle East studies journal, an area studies journal. This idea of who can and cannot theorize, I think, again, think twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times before you turn somebody away because of, what they're writing about and what sort of assumptions have been made about the scholar as well, right? Because these overlap. But I think that for young scholars who are writing about their own parts of the world, and those parts of the world are not in the West, this is extremely frustrating. When you want to theorize gender, you want to theorize sexuality, you want to theorize race and class, and you're being told that you belong in an area studies journal, which is also unfair to area studies journals because they also produce theory as well, right? But I think that that's also something, thinking carefully about what is and what is not rejected, because if somebody gets a desk rejection within 45 minutes of submitting a journal article, and they're told it's not for this disciplinary journal, it's for an area studies journal, their work hasn't been engaged with, right? In any kind of substantive way. So I think that is also something that needs to be thought about, who are you allowing space to theorize? And what geographies are you taking seriously as theoretical locales and not just kind of raw data?
That is such a great response. I will try and take that to the journals department as soon as possible. But we're at time, and as much as I'd love to continue chatting about this, I know you have other obligations. So I just, again, really wanted to thank you so much for your time and for your experiences and for your knowledge. And hopefully we can have some more fruitful conversations about how we can make, you know, life easier for women of color in academia in particular. So yes, thank you. And for anyone who is attending and wants to find out about any future events that we're holding, we're on Twitter at Sage Publishing. So thank you. Bye.
Also, Lena, can I just say, I'm happy if you send me the questions, I'm happy to answer them and then send you my answers.
Oh, amazing. Okay.
Well. Yeah,
I'll do that. Thank you so much. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.